be so kind as to put in the chat bar any question or concern or about publishing, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Something that you've come to this session with, a question in your mind, or something you've always been curious about, or something you really hope that we'll grapple with in the next hour. And I'll try and make sure that I deal with whatever questions and comments are in the chat bar. So if you want to use the next few minutes to put into the chat bar anything, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So any question or comment or concern that you have, and I'll do my best to include it. Thanks.
Well, good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at the Center for Postgraduate Studies for our workshop titled The World of Academic Publishing, A Look Behind the Scenes. This workshop promises to offer insights into how scholarly work get published, and joining us is Sue McKenna, who is a professor of higher education here at the Center for Postgraduate Studies. She is particularly interested in how knowledge is created in different contexts and how researchers come to take on the practices of their fields. Sue heads up several large funded projects directed towards enhancing postgraduate education across the continent and is the recipient of the 2022 Rhodes University Internationalization Award and the 2022 Vice Chancellor's Book Award. She's a member of ASAF and an NRFB rated scientist, and I know that she quite has experience in terms of the publishing industry. But before moving on to Sue, just to do some bit of housekeeping, please be on the lookout to your chats so as to see two links that we'll be posting. One of the links is a link on a writing retreat that we are having in 2 weeks' time, which is focusing on publishing as well. So we are accepting applications from those who are currently busy with writing up their draft articles as well as chapters for publishing, etc. So please do click on the link and apply. And remember that applications are on a basis of what you are busy with, and also on a basis of first come, first serve, as we have limited spaces for the retreat. And the other link is a link to evaluate this workshop as well as other engagements that you are having at CPGS, so that we can ensure that we provide better engagements and engagements that speaks to the needs of postgraduate students as well as postdocs and academics at Rhodes University. Let me not waste any time. We don't have time today. Sue, welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to facilitate this workshop for us.
Thanks, Asipe. Lovely to be here, even though I'll quickly turn on my camera just to prove that I'm not AI, that I am a real human being. And I'm going to turn it off again so that we can get started. Thank you so much to those people who've already put a few questions into the chat bar. Please feel free to continue to put questions into the chat bar. I'm hoping that my presentation will take about half an hour, and then I want to go to the chat bar and answer questions there if there are any questions that I haven't already answered. So let me get started. And as I go along, please feel very free to put up your hand if you want to interrupt me, ask a question as I go along, or put your question in the chat bar and I'll try and answer it at the end. So the first thing I want to say is to really urge you to take on an understanding of what academic publishing is meant to be all about. Unfortunately, in today's day and age, increasingly many academics and even established professors think that publication is about getting a publication, a thing that can go on your CV, that you can exchange for a promotion, that can make you more likely to get a job, that can help you with your ratings, and that can help your university with their ranking. Now, those things may well be true, but that understanding of a publication as a thing, as a commodity, as a product is only a very small part of the truth. And if that's your only understanding of publications, I can absolutely assure you, you will have additional challenges in building an academic career, because understanding a publication as something you have to get because you can exchange it like money for some other goods, maybe will get you 1 or 2 publications, but it's not going to give you a rich intellectual life that will sustain your ability to create and disseminate knowledge for the rest of your career. Unfortunately, this understanding of a publication as a thing that you exchange is the dominant one. It's one you're often going to hear, even from your supervisors. You need to get published. We hear it in our universities. How many publications have you got? And so the way in which we talk about publications is hugely problematic, because we talk about publications as if it is a thing that you can buy and sell, that you can own, that you can exchange. And even though this is the dominant understanding, I want you to try and hold on to the actual purpose of publishing, which is knowledge dissemination. So the real purpose of publishing, and if you fully embrace this real purpose and come to understand it and value it, you will have a much more rewarding, and I assure you, much longer academic career. And that real purpose is academic publishing is just one way of telling other people in the knowledge community what you found, helping them to think about something, providing them with an argument. That's what publishing is. It's you participating in a conversation. So when you read articles, you are reading the conversation. When you write articles, you are speaking into the conversation. And there are times when other kinds of knowledge dissemination might even be better than an academic journal article. It might be better to run a workshop, to produce a poster, to make a pamphlet, to write a policy brief. All of these things are about disseminating knowledge. So you in the room are all intellectuals. I think most of you are probably emerging researchers. So you're still finding your voice. You're still thinking about what you want to contribute. But you are already members of a field or transdisciplinary series of fields. You are already someone who is participating in knowledge creation and dissemination. So when you decide to publish, try and hold on to the idea that you are not trying to get a publication. You are trying to disseminate knowledge. And it might sound at this point that I'm just using different words for the same thing, but these are ideologically fundamentally different. Getting a publication is just doing a thing to get the money or to get the exchange or to get the line on your CV, whereas disseminating knowledge is actively participating as an intellectual within a knowledge community. And even though publications will indeed build your CV, that leads to promotion and rating and permanent jobs and whatever else, that is true. I think that only framing publication in those terms and hunting for publications in those terms is not sustainable, because you are not likely to write very strong articles that are more likely to get published if you think you're just trying to get a publication, and you're not likely to sustain that energy and that rich reward and sometimes heartache of sharing the knowledge. So that's my first and main point today, is that when you are submitting an article for publication, you are basically saying to the editor, I have something to say to you and your readers, and this is what I have to contribute. The editor then makes a decision, is this worth sending to reviewers? And the editor won't read the whole article generally. I'm an editor on a Quintile 1 journal, which means that we have, I think it's 2,400 articles were sent to us last year. And 93% of those were rejected. So only 7% make it through. So I speak from harsh experience of having far more articles on my desk than we can ever accept. I don't read them all. I read the title, I read the abstract, I might glance at the reference list. And what I'm looking for is, what contribution does this article make? What is their argument? What's their take-home message? And will that be of interest to our readers? So I know my journal, I know what we're looking for, I know what conversations we host in our journal, and I make a gut decision on the basis of the title, the abstract, and the reference list. And maybe if I've got time and I'm interested, I might read more, or if I'm not quite sure on the basis of the abstract, should I or shouldn't I waste my reviewer's time? I might read a little bit more. But generally speaking, that's all I read to make that first decision. Should I send this to reviewers, knowing that we overburden our reviewers, that it's really hard to get reviews? More and more people are overwhelmed with being asked to do reviews and say no, or they say yes, but they never do it in time. And it can take months and hundreds of requests just to get 2 reviews. Well, not hundreds, but it can take 30 or 40 requests just to get 2 reviews on an article. So I'm not going to send an article out as the editor to reviewers if I don't think that there's a chance that this article has something to say. So the most common reason for rejection is because I look at that and I just say, this person's just reporting on something. They're reporting on a study they did. And it's not clear to me the answer to the most important question. So what? So what? So you did a study. So what? I mean, good for you. You interviewed 30 people. You collected 50 samples. You used this complicated statistical analysis. But what were your findings and why should we care? I should know that from the abstract enough to have a real sense of, this person's got something to say. And so if you are just trying to get a publication, you might be so fixed on just reporting, this is what I did, this is what the literature says, this was the methods I followed, this is what I found, conclusion. Well, maybe that's enough to get you your master's, your PhD, maybe. But the only reason we want to publish something is to disseminate knowledge, to give our readers something to think about, to help them understand a phenomenon in a new way, or to provide a critical position, or to add, it doesn't have to be Nobel Prize winning worthy. It doesn't have to blow the entire field out the water. It doesn't have to be radically new knowledge or a radically new position. It can be any of those things, but it doesn't have to be. Most articles are not. But it must clearly have something to contribute. Have some knowledge that you are, as the author, you really want the real. What is it you're trying to do with that article? What's the purpose of the article? So what? If you can't answer the so what, you're not ready to write the article. Every article needs to have a so what, have an argument. And when I say argument, obviously I don't mean in the English meaning of the word, where argument means to fight, to contradict, to challenge, to any of those necessarily negative words. In academia, argument means to take a position on something and to convincingly argue for that position, to try and convince your readers that this is what they should think or this is what they should understand. So you need to have a so what. You've done a bit of empirical study, you found something. Okay, great. Don't just report on it. Convince me of why it's important. So you need to have a real sense of what is the knowledge that you are disseminating and why should I care? That will help you not only to craft your article around building that argument with sufficient evidence for that argument, that by the time the reader gets to the end, they'll go, okay, I agree, or now I understand, or whatever it might be. But it will also help you not just to craft the article, it will also help you decide where to publish the article. Because where do you publish the article? You publish it where the people that you are talking to will be reading. So if you are trying to argue about a particular theory, or if you found something in a laboratory experiment and you're trying to show how this builds the field, what journal are the people who will use the knowledge you're disseminating likely to be reading? If you think you're just trying to get a publication, you might be restricted in your thinking when you choose a journal. You're just thinking, which one's most likely to publish me? Or which one's on the accredited lists? Something I could talk about in a moment. But what you really should be asking is, I've got an argument. I've got an article which builds this argument, which convinces my reader of this argument. Where are these readers? What journal are they reading? Because that's where I want to publish. And typically you can see that from your own reference list. Because you're joining a conversation, you're making a contribution. Your journal article is an argument, it's a contribution, it's a knowledge dissemination. And other people have been talking about that phenomena. Other people have been doing experiments in this field and doing work in this field, and they've been publishing it. And you are drawing on their voices in your article. So if you look at your reference list, what journals are in your reference list? Because those are the journals that are hosting the conversation that you're participating in. So your reference list, I think, is your best way of choosing where to publish. Okay, moving along. I think I've said most of what's on this slide. Why do we publish? We're contributing to a conversation. It's highly unlikely you're the first person to ever use a particular theory, a particular technology, to look at a particular chemical or particular phenomenon of whatever kind. There are probably others. They might have come at it from slightly different angles to you, but you're joining a conversation that pre-existed you. That's why you have a literature review, to say, look, this is what other people are saying about this thing. This is the current thinking on this phenomenon. So where is that conversation? Who's in that conversation? How are you drawing on that conversation to build your own contribution? And that is what your article is. It's you walking into a dinner party where everyone's talking about something, you listen to what everyone's saying, and then you open your mouth and you say what it is that you would like to contribute to the conversation. Sometimes you have actually solved a problem in the field and you want to publish in order to share the solution to help others. Sometimes you're building a field. There's a field of research on a particular phenomenon, and you're helping take it forward into methodologically, theoretically, whatever it might be. Sometimes it's also about showing links and collaborations between different sets of literature, bringing them together in conversation in your own writing. Sometimes you're advocating for a very particular position. You're trying to convince your readers that this is how they should be thinking on a particular issue. So some writing might be more activist in nature, arguing for a particular school of thought, a particular way of doing things. But whatever it is that you're doing, you are joining a conversation and you need to make a contribution. You can't just be summing up the literature and telling us this is what this person said, this is what this person said, this is what this person said. I can go and read those people myself, thank you very much. You don't need to tell me what everyone else is saying. I need to know what your article is contributing. It doesn't have to be Nobel Prize winning worthy, but it does need to be a very clear argument? Can you, in one sentence, say, this is what this article is that I'm writing is arguing, is contributing. This is the main message. And then you use the entire body of the article to build the case for that message, to provide the evidence to convince your readers of it. So you need to know, what is that argument? What is the take-home message? What's the point of your article? What is your contribution? What is the answer to so what? Because I would suggest, as an editor, as I said, probably the most common instant rejection reason is that it just sounds like a report, which is great to write a report to tell your supervisor what you did, write a report to your funders. Reports have many important purposes. If you are working for industry, you write a report to show what you found. But academic publishing is not just a report. It must be, you can report on your research in order to convince us of what? What is that message you're trying to give us as readers? So then you need to think, well, who are these readers? Who is it that will benefit from my take-home message, my argument, my contribution? And why is this so important? Why is it important where everybody's just trying to publish or perish, publish or perish? Why should we read your article? If you don't have a sense that you've got something worthwhile to say, it doesn't have to be huge, but it must be something, then it's going to be very hard for you to write. As I said in the beginning, it's really important, in my view, if you want to have a strong academic career, that you do not get caught into the idea that a publication is a thing, a commodity, and you have to stack them up in a pile to get yourself a secure employment. I think it's important, if you really want to sustain an academic career, to think of every piece of writing you do as a contribution to the conversation. And that's far more exciting, far more rewarding, and far more likely to sustain you. But that thinking also means that you don't always just publish in academic journal articles. So there are times where I've written a few books with colleagues. I haven't actually written a monograph, which is where you are the sole author. I've always co-authored, but that's because I've got, where there's a bigger project and we have more to say. So we've written a book. It's not just a thesis, which is a slightly different thing. You can take a thesis and turn it into a book, but a book is far more focused not on showing your ability, but on contributing to the conversation. It could be a chapter in a book. Sometimes that's more useful than an academic article. It's often you can write a bit longer. I've written a number of news articles. I find that often a very useful way. I've got a contribution. I want people to understand something. Academic journal articles, for example, one of my pieces of research is on rankings. Now, I write a lot. I do a lot of academic research on rankings, and I publish on university rankings in academic journals. But I also want to speak to the public, and they don't read academic journals, the general public. So that's where it's worth doing articles for newspapers, radio interviews, television interviews. So knowledge dissemination, you've got to think about, well, who do I want to disseminate it to? And go to where that is. It might be a workshop, might be a pamphlet, might be a poster, might be a policy brief, because you're not just trying to get a publication, you're trying to disseminate knowledge. I've asked you all the way through, so please keep doing this. Any questions or concerns? I'm going to carry on going through the PowerPoint, and I'll come back to the chat bar at the end. So I see there are a few coming in, but if you've got a burning question, pop it into the chat bar. So you've got this article that you're starting to write. You haven't written it completely yet, but all you know is what's the particular argument, the particular contribution you want to make. Maybe you've done a whole master's thesis or PhD thesis. You don't summarize a whole master's or PhD thesis into a single article. You don't need to tell them the whole complex story that you told your examiners and other people who read your thesis. For a journal article, it's one standalone contribution. So what is the contribution you want to make? You need to know that. Then you can maybe start mind mapping and think, well, if this is the argument I'm trying to make, what parts of what literature will I need to draw on? What part of the methodology will I need to explain? how do I explain my findings? How do I make sure that it's clear to the reader how those findings do indeed support the main contribution or argument that I'm making? But you haven't actually drafted a beautiful full article yet. You've just kind of got a clear idea of what your argument is and a rough mind map or draft. I would suggest that's the point at which you choose where you want to publish. Before you really start getting the nuts and bolts and beautiful sentences and making sure you've got coherence and checking your references, before you do any of that, the actual proper writing, I would suggest that's the point at which you choose a publication. And as I said before, I think that one of the key ways of choosing where to publish is to think, well, what is my contribution and who do I want to give it to as a gift? What conversation am I joining? Where's that conversation taking place? Look at your reference list. Look at the key literature that you're going to be drawing on to make that contribution and see where those articles have been published. What journals are those articles in? I said to you earlier, as an editor, I'll read the title, the abstract, and the reference list I might go to. And one of the reasons for that is often the journal that I am on the editorial board for is Higher Education. It's just called Higher Education, and it looks at research about universities. And if I see an abstract that's often it'll be very much about psychology. So it'll be, that's just one example. It could be something else, but a very psychological abstract about learners' cognitive functions. But there's nothing really about higher education. I'll quickly flip to the reference list to see, well, what journals are they referencing? Because if they're only referencing psychology journals, this is not the conversation with my journal. They should submit that to a psychology journal. So the reference list tells the editor, and it should tell you as the author, what conversation am I joining? As a rule of thumb, it's not an absolute rule, but as a rule of thumb, I wouldn't send a journal article to a journal that isn't referenced at least once in the reference list, because you're joining a conversation that is being hosted like a dinner party. You're walking in and you're listening to what everyone else is saying, and then you're making your contribution. If you send it to a journal in a completely different area, it's like you've walked into the wrong dinner party. So that's one of the things to consider. There are other things you might want to consider. Very importantly, your readership. Who are these readers? Are you using very specialized terminology that you just expect your reader to understand, which is fine, but then you must send it to a specialized journal where all the readers of that journal understand it. If you're wanting to speak in a way that goes to readers across disciplines, you can't use words, terms, concepts that the person across disciplines can't be expected to understand. Or if you do use them, you need to use up some of your word count to explain them. So you need to think carefully about who your reader is when thinking about, can I just use this term? Will everyone understand it? Or do I need to explain it? Are you writing to an international audience, or in which case maybe there's some specific terms you have to explain? Look at the aims and scope of the journal. Every good journal has a website, and you'll have aims and scope. They might call it purpose or strategic plan, whatever they call it. Usually aims and scope. The editors of the journal spend a lot of time every year tweaking that and thinking, well, okay, we are the editors of a journal. This journal is host to various conversations. What are the conversations we're interested in hosting? And that's what we explain in our aims and scope. This is what this journal is interested in. Is it interested in small-scale qualitative studies? Is it interested in the politics of higher education? Is it interested in historical comparisons? Read the aims and scope, because if your particular contribution in your draft article that you're planning doesn't address what they tell you they're trying to host in their journal, you can't send it to that journal. It might be important to you. In South Africa, the part of the funding formula is that funding is paid to the university for articles published by staff and students within particular accredited journals. So these lists, they're very long lists of accredited journals, have sort of a tick mark next to them of, okay, we've checked these out, these are okay quality. So if you publish in any of those, not only are you pretty certain that it's okay quality of the journal, but also it carries a lot more weighting in South Africa because those are the articles that bring funding into the institution. And if you're an emerging researcher, if you're starting out, that's probably very important to you. It's probably less important to very established academics who don't really care whether it's accredited or not. They're more interested in is it where the conversation's happening. But look, your top journals are all going to be on these lists. So these are the lists: Scopus, Web of Science, IBSS, what's that stand for? International Bibliography of Social Sciences, I think. Cielo, South Africa, the Norwegian list number 2, and the DOAJ is the Directory of Open Access Journal, and then the DHET is South Africa's Department of Higher Education and Training. They have their own list of journals that perhaps that might be on some of those others, because there's quite a lot of overlap between these lists. But they also have some additional South African journals on the DHET list. So if you are choosing a journal, you can check it against any of these lists and see if it's on one of those lists. That's probably important for emerging researchers. Some of you might care about the impact factor. I never even knew about impact factor when I was starting out, and I must say I still wouldn't particularly care about it, but I know for some people it's important. Basically, the impact factor shows you, the higher the impact factor, it says that journal is very read by people in the field because a lot of people cite articles. So if you publish in a high impact journal, it definitely has more status, and it suggests that it's more likely that your article will be read and then be referenced, be cited by others. So that might be something, and you can use Clarivate. Web of Science have got an impact factor list. Scimago, I think, is the easiest one. I think it's, I'm going to put it in there. I think it's JR. I'm not sure if it's .com, but it's Scimago JR. Maybe it's .com. And you can put in the name of any journal. It'll tell you the impact factor of that journal. So the other thing to realize is I can't tell you what's a good impact factor because it varies by field. So in some fields you'd want it to be over 100, others over 30 is high. So I would suggest what you do is you just play with Scimago or Clarivate Web of Science and put in a few titles of various journals that you've been reading articles from, and sort of get a sense of what the top journals are in your field if you're worried about impact factor. As I say, for me, it's always about what is my argument and who do I want to read this argument. If I follow those rules, the rest can take care of itself. That's my advice, is always follow those rules. I think I've already said this, the focus on getting a publication, I think, can feel overwhelming at times. It can make you think in very instrumentalist ways. I've just got to sit down and write this thing and send it off, rather than enjoying, and yes, it is not always 100% enjoyable, but rather thinking of it like, how am I going to craft this argument? Is this going to be convincing? Do I need more evidence for this claim? And having that sense that you're part of something, you're part of a knowledge field. You're disseminating something you're trying to convince people of. I think that trying to hold on to that understanding of publishing is far more likely to sustain you over time. So that very quickly is what I wanted to say about publishing generally, because I want to get on with some of these questions. And if you've got other questions, we have, oh good, I said I was going to take half an hour. We have half an hour now to actually tackle your questions. Any question you can think of, you're welcome to put up your hand or to pop it in the chat bar. I'm going to go through the chat bar and answer these questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. There's something you've been worrying about. You're wondering, are we allowed to do this? Can we do that? Should I do that? I might not always have the answers, but I'd be very happy to tackle whatever questions you might have. I'm going to start with Nana, who says, What do editors look for when you are writing a conceptual paper? I think, like any paper, we're looking to see what is the contribution, what is the argument, what is the answer to the so what? And a conceptual paper, perhaps even more. A conceptual paper can take a position, can argue about a particular issue or phenomenon. So a conceptual paper can't just be a summary of what's being said about a certain issue. It's really got to take a position, perhaps even more explicitly than ever before. I'm going to very quickly in the chat bar put something that I want to mention to you all, which partly answers Nana's question, report, and so in the chat bar now, I have put 4 words. This is from Kamler and Thompson. Kamler and Thompson suggest that even though this is just a rule of thumb, it's not an absolute rule, they suggest that a good abstract in any field has 4 parts: locate, focus, report, and argue. Not always in that exact order, but usually in that order. And locate might be half a sentence, it might be a full sentence, it might be 3 sentences, and the same for the others. But basically, they suggest locate. Locate is tell us what the big problem area is. Draw the reader in with a big problem area. Tuberculosis remains a global killer despite there being a cure. Something like that. A real pulling us in, telling us the big area, the big field in which your article makes a contribution. You locate it within the big problem area. Then you focus. What specific part of this big issue, tuberculosis is a global killer, will you be honing in on? So that might be tuberculosis is a global killer despite there being a cure. One of the main reasons is a lack of compliance with the long-term medication. Then report. Tell us what you actually did. This article reports on a long-term study on, I can't even think of the words, it's not my field, a long-term study on taking the medicine. 20 people were interviewed over a period of 5 years, and an analysis was done using Glickett's theory. So that's report. Tell us what you did. And then argue. Argue is the punchline. That's the key thing. So what? Why should we know? Why should we care? Why should we read this article? What are you giving me as the reader? What is the contribution? And that's the argument. Therefore, it's evident that ongoing follow-ups are absolutely necessary if we are going to get rid of TB, whatever it is. So even if it's a conceptual paper, you can still follow that kind of process. Don't just tell us, no article should just be a summary of the literature or a summary of a position. It should take the reader with the author should take the reader by the hand through the steps of the article to the conclusion, by which time the reader goes, right, yes, I've got it. I get it. Nana also asked, do you start writing before you look for a journal or the other way around? Well, great. Well, I think I partially answered that already. I wouldn't write a whole article and then look for a journal because I'm making a contribution to a conversation. So I need to know quite early on which conversation am I joining, because I need to read the aims and scope of that journal. I need to think about what readers, are they international, are they national, are they experts, are they not? Because when I'm crafting the article, I'm crafting it for them. Also, of course, each journal will also have author guidelines. And I didn't say earlier, but one of the things I should have said is a very common desktop projection. Desktop projection is when the editor doesn't send it to the reviewers. So the editor, which is the first person who looks at your submission, looks at the title, looks at the abstract, looks at your reference list, maybe skim reads a bit of the article, and makes a decision, send to reviewer or reject. And if they reject, it's called a desktop projection. One of the most common reasons is because the person hasn't followed the author guidelines, especially a journal that's got thousands of submissions every year. if you're going to send in an article and we clearly say that your abstract has to have these subsections, or the abstract should be 200 words and your abstract's 560 words, we just don't have time. Maybe you're lucky and it's a small journal and they're very kind and they'll send it back and tell you to rearrange and use their referencing style and whatever else they've called for. But most journals won't. So that's another reason to choose your journal before you completely write it and polish it, because you're writing it towards a very specific journal. The other thing you can do is when you've chosen your journal, go and do an extra search in that journal on your phenomenon that you're reporting on, in case there's one or two more recent articles, perhaps, that have come out and that you want to draw on, because you're joining a conversation that's taking place in that journal. And so if you can show connections to the conversation that's already happening in that journal, that's fantastic. I always tell my own students and myself to have a journal A and a journal B. And so your journal A is the one that is your first prize for whatever reason, because it's the perfect fit. It's where your contribution is most useful. It's accredited. It's got high impact, whatever else you're concerned with. And you follow the author guidelines exactly and you submit it there. And then you get rejected. It happens. It's common. Everyone gets rejected. I get rejected all the time. There are no established academics that don't face rejection on a regular basis. So you get a rejection. If you're lucky, you get some feedback with that rejection. It's not just a sorry, not for us. You get a little bit of feedback and you can use that feedback to make the article stronger, and you can send it to Journal B. If you've got Journal B planned before you even send to Journal A, yes, you have to rearrange the article now to suit the author guidelines of Journal B, to make sure that it adjusts the readership or whatever else you have to do. The tone might be slightly different. You follow all the requirements of Journal B. But because you had Journal B sort of in your back pocket all the time, you only cry for a short while when you get your rejection, because you don't have time to cry for too long, because you've got to get it ready for Journal B. And you send it off to Journal B. It's an absolute taboo. Do not ever send an article to 2 or more journals at the same time. That is absolutely not allowed. And you can be blacklisted if you do that. And the reason for that is because it's so hard to get reviewers. The editors are hustling to get reviewers and to get the reviews in, and people say no, and then you've got to find more reviewers. And if we go through that whole process and then we get back to you and we say, okay, we're quite interested, we want a resubmission, whatever. And then you say, oh, it's okay, thanks, I'm publishing it somewhere else. You will have some very, very angry editors and reviewers. So you can only send it to one at a time. Hey, Joy, I'm looking at yours next. How do you transfer conference papers into journal publications? Because many editors insist the papers cannot have been published earlier. Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a relatively new one. And it's to do with this idea of publication as a commodity, because journals now don't want a commodity that's already out there. And many of them will even use Turnitin in problematic ways to check that you're not publishing something that's already been published. I would suggest that if you're wanting to publish an article that you're presenting at a conference, most conferences will allow you to just publish the abstract in the conference proceedings. If you publish your full paper in the conference proceedings, make sure it's an accredited conference proceedings. So some conferences do have accredited proceedings, especially in the field of IS or IT. Most conference proceedings are not accredited. So you'll still have it on your CV that you did this conference presentation, but it won't count in that same way that a journal article will. So I love the idea of trying out something at a conference. I present at a conference, I get verbal feedback from my peers, helps me strengthen my contribution, and then I send it to an article, to a journal. But in that case, I wouldn't send the full paper to the conference. Many conferences you can choose to publish just the abstract or the full paper. And I generally wouldn't publish a full paper through a conference proceeding, because conference proceedings are much less likely to be read widely and to be cited. They can be, and you certainly can read conference proceedings if they're available online. You can definitely reference them in your own writing. But Typically speaking, they're not as easily accessible. They don't come up as easily on the databases. And often they don't go through as rigorous a peer review process as a journal article. So sometimes they're not as good a quality. So my advice, it differs from field to field, and there are some conferences that are very high status, and their proceedings are rigorously double-blind peer-reviewed, and they are accredited. But that's more or less the exception. I'd say by and large, I wouldn't submit my full paper to a conference proceeding if you've got a choice. Verona, if you're writing a long paper, should you stick to the 8,000 word count or can it be less? Okay, yes, you can. I mean, all journals, I presume all of them, in their author guidelines will tell you what their maximum word count is. So I would say you definitely don't want to go over the maximum word count. Look, if it says 6,000 words, to be honest, if it was 6,056, it probably doesn't matter. But I would rather err on the side of caution and edit it down to 5,999. If it says the maximum is 6,000 words and you submit a 7,200 word article, you may well get a desktop reject, and you've spent ages writing this absolutely brilliant article. No one's going to read it. The editor's going to, in fact, you might even find there's a layer before in some cases where an administrator will say, sorry, word count too big, go away, send it somewhere else. But how much can you be below the word count, I think is more your question. I think if you've said something, you've said it fully and convincingly, that there aren't questions in the reader's mind that need a bit more explaining and a bit more fleshing out, and you really have done the job. It doesn't matter how long it is, as long as it's fully done the job. It's very clearly got a contribution. I know what that contribution, that argument, that take-home message, I know what it is. You've provided me with the convincing viewpoint, the evidence, I think it's very possible that it's quite a lot shorter. Having said that, I would say it would be a big exception if they say it's maximum 8,000 words, which is quite long, but in humanities that's not unusual. If they say it's maximum 8,000 words, I would be very surprised if you were sending in an article that was less than 6,000 words. There might be the most brilliant article they've ever published that's only 3,000 words, but that would be unlikely. So as a rule of thumb, I would probably say, you don't want to be more than, I don't know, 20% less than what they say. But these are all just rules of thumb. The real question is it a convincing article? Does it do the job that it needs to do? And key to that, I would say, is you don't know very well yourself because you're the author and you're so invested in it, you can't see your own flaws. So when you've written your article and you've rewritten it and you've rewritten it and you've edited it, I would suggest two things before you submit it. One, print it out and read it aloud. There's something very different about reading from the paper than from reading from a screen. So if you can afford to, and I don't always do this, but I do think it's good practice, actually read it off a hard copy and read it aloud. I always do that. Before I submit something, I sit in my room and I look like a mad person because there's no one else in the room, but I'm literally saying the words aloud, not in my head. And there's some research on this, that if you say the words aloud, you can hear the flow, you can pick up errors in a way that you don't if you just read it in your head. So that's the first thing I would do before I hit submit. And the second thing I would do before I hit submit is to get someone else to read it. Ask your supervisor to read it, ask a peer to read it, ask a friend to read it. Preferably someone in the field who can give you input on the actual content. But if you can't find someone in your field, just get anyone to read it for you. It's incredible how we don't see our own errors. Right, then I see CPGS. I've got a workshop evaluation. And so please, 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 can you click on that link and fill in the evaluation? I know it's so important to CPGS to hear from you what you want in these workshops. And they've also got a link for a lovely, lovely writing retreat, which sounds so nice. And I hope you've all clicked on that link and booked because it's first come, first served. Then we've got Makasi Temba. Makasi Temba says, Do reviewers consider if you've referenced some articles for the target journal? Does not referencing reduce the chances of your paper being accepted? No, they don't. The reviewers won't even know. The editors might know, but I don't think there'll be any editors that petty that would say, oh, well, you said no, you wouldn't review for us, so we're not going to send your article out to review. I like to think, I hope I'm right, that editors really care about their journals, about the conversation, about the field that they're part of. Having said that, please, please, please do as many reviews as you can. Doing reviews helps you hone your own skills as a writer. The art of reviewing is a very tough one. I always say, even if it's a double-blind peer review, which is the most common one, which means I don't know, when I get asked to review, I don't know who the author of the piece was. And then when they get my comments, they won't know that it's me. But I have a rule of thumb, I won't write anything that I wouldn't be willing to say aloud to the person. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. Sometimes that's hard to keep to because you get to review some really badly written and really problematic articles that just make me mad. But I still try and keep to it and try and think, even if I have to tell the author, this article is really not ready for publication. You haven't done enough reading. You really haven't thought this through. This argument is weak. This is problematic. Can I do that in a way that doesn't leave them debilitated? Of course, it's going to hurt them because they thought they were going to get publication. They thought they were disseminating something worthwhile. Of course, it's going to be hurt them, but can I do it in a way that doesn't leave them overwhelmed and debilitated? That even if they do cry, they only cry for a very short while, that they get a sense that they can continue and do better rather than they get a sense of, well, I'm useless, I'm never going to try again. So if you are going to do reviews, and I urge you to do reviews, try and think, what can I say in this review that I'd be willing to say to the person's face? What can I say in this review that'll help the person take it forward, make it stronger, do better? How can I help and support them? But to go back to your question, Makasitemba, I would say no. Just because you said no when they asked you to do a review is not going to make any difference if you ask them to look at your article. Nana says, what is the distinction between articles for publication and writing a book chapter in terms of structure and key features? That varies so much by field. It would be hard for me to say because I think it'll look very different in physics to chemistry to philosophy and so on. Generally speaking, a book chapter allows you to go a bit, have a bit bigger word count, generally speaking. But also a book needs to have something that holds it together, right? So a book of chapters, there must be some overarching theme, overarching methodology, overarching concern, problem area, whatever it is. And so what's really important when you're writing a book chapter is to have a strong sense of what the editors of the book are trying to do. What are they hoping that their book will do? And to make sure that your chapter contributes to that bigger agenda of the book as a whole. I've edited a number of books and people they write a chapter on their project without linking it sufficiently and clearly enough to the conversation that the book is trying to host. The other thing to consider, and again, it's just a rule of thumb, but journal articles are generally more widely read and more widely cited than book chapters. So if you get asked to write a book chapter, is it a good quality book? Is it good quality editors? Are there people that are known in your field? It's often a great opportunity to contribute a book chapter. So you should definitely consider it. But you might want to think, is it a book that's probably going to sell 30 copies? And so maybe 30 or 40 people will read it, or maybe a couple of libraries will buy copies and it'll be more widely read. Whereas journal articles, generally speaking, of course, they're really good journals and there's some really bad journals. Generally speaking, journal articles get more widely read. So, these are decisions. But most of us who disseminate a lot of knowledge, you'll have a mix over the years. You'll have some book chapters, you might have some articles, and so on. Accreditation. Okay, great. Thanks. I don't know if I'm saying your name right. Is it Maite? How do I say your name?
It's Maite.
Maite.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maite. Accreditation. So there are in South Africa, it's peculiar to South Africa. There's no one other country that does this. In South Africa, there are these lists of databases that are considered accredited, which means that the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is the ministry that funds our universities, has said these lists of journals, these databases, are good quality, and all the journals on them are good quality. And I'm going to try and open the list and show it to you. And so any students or staff who publish in one of those journals, it'll be counted in the money that goes to the university, because the Department of Higher Education and Training pays universities a sum of money every year related to how many students are there, how many staff are there, how many graduates have you had. And one of the many things that goes into the formula for how much money universities get from the state is how many publications have you had. But they only count the publications that are on one of these lists. And that's why many universities in South Africa are very, very concerned to say that their students and staff must only publish in journals that are on one of these lists, because they want to get the money. So for some people, especially if you're starting out, that's going to be very important, because you wanting everyone to say, yeah, look, they've got on their CV, they've got 2, 3, 4, 5 publications or whatever, and they're all accredited, or 4 out of 5 are accredited. It just suggests that you've brought money to the university, whether you know it or not, but B, that you've chosen journals that are generally recognized as being high quality. Now, unfortunately, there are some journals that slip into these lists that are really predatory, problematic, and then they are only on the list for a year by accident and then get taken off the list. And the opposite is also true. There are some journals out there that are really good quality that are not on the lists yet. So, for example, to get on these lists, they each have their own different criteria, these organizations. Some of them are international. So Web of Science, this particular list is the word that you can see now. This is the Web of Science list. So all of these journals, and we're still only on the A's, all of these journals are accredited. And in order to get onto the Web of Science accredited list, they've got all sorts of rules, such as, is it double-blind peer-reviewed? Has it got an international editorial board? Has it got a high rejection rate? Yes, believe it or not, that is considered a good thing. Does it come out when it's meant to? Are they properly proofread? They've got all these different rules. So basically, you know that, look, I'm only on B. You know that if you have chosen a journal, I'm still on the Web of Science, I'm up to CD. If you publish in any of these journals, generally speaking, it's considered good quality. But in order to get onto these lists, you've got to have a bit of a history as a journal, to meet those criteria I just said, like, do you have double-blind peer reviewing? Do you come out on time? Is it properly proofread? So journals that are just starting out is one example of journals that might be really good quality, and in 5 years' time, they might be on all of these lists and considered really good. But when they're first starting out, they're not going to be on any of these lists. So I might, for example, publish in a journal that's not yet accredited, but I know it's starting out. I think it's interesting. I think it's going to become good. And I want to publish there because I think they are tapping into a readership I'm interested in. But if you're just starting out as an academic, you might not want to take that chance that I would be happy to take. You might say, no, let me stick to an accredited journal. So what I've just shown you now is the Web of Science list. And it goes on and on and on. I'm still going through it. Okay, oops. What did I do? So if I have a look at the Web of Science list, how many were there? 14,862 journals on that particular list. Then there's the SciELO, which is a South African list. IBSS is an international one. Directory of Open Access Journals. That might be something that you want to consider if you're wanting to take a view that you want your articles to be available to anyone. and that it shouldn't only be available to those people who have access through their college libraries. You know, those many articles, you click on an article and it says you've got to pay $39.99 or whatever. We're very lucky at Rhodes University because our university does pay for access to very expensive databases. So 9 times out of 10, you have access to articles that most researchers on this continent do not have access to. And if there's an article that you want to get that is not accessible through Rhodes University, generally our librarians will get it for you through interlibrary loan. So we're in a very privileged position of being able to access almost any journal article. Whereas on the rest of the continent, and I do quite a lot of work in other countries in Africa, the universities cannot afford the millions of rands or whatever their currency is to pay for these databases. And so they have very limited access to knowledge. And so for some of us, we take a strong kind of political view that we should publish in open access, which means that anyone, anywhere in the world doesn't have to pay to see it. So Department Director of Open Access Journals are all the open access journals. However, it's a big however, some of these open access journals, so these are all open access, nobody pays to read them. And they're all considered relatively good quality to be on this, to be on the DOAJ list. It means that these are good quality open access journals. The however is that some of them are what's considered diamond open access, which means the author doesn't pay to get it published, the reader doesn't pay to read it, any costs associated with proofreading and layout and so on, a university will host that journal and covers the costs. So it's not a profit-making thing. But many of these journals are not diamond open access. They are what's called gold open access, which means the article's free to the reader, but the author's university has to pay a whole lot of money to get it published. And most universities won't pay that. So make sure you know if there is a charge to be paid for publishing, you need to find that out first and check with the research office. Rhodes University Research Office will pay for page fees. Many open access journals charge just a little bit to cover the costs of what they call page fees, layout fees, and so on. That's not very high. It's a small amount. The research office will pay it as long as it's an accredited journal. But some of these gold open access journals cost like 100,000 Rand to get your article published, which is really nonsense. I'm out of time, but I see that there are, I hope that has helped a bit. This particular list, this is the 2024 list. It changes all the time, but I mean, it doesn't change so radically. Most journals are on this every single year. And you can get this from the library, this list, or I can send it to you. And then I'm quickly going into a couple more comments. I think I've spoken about open access articles. For me, that's important. I try as much as possible to publish in open access journals so that anyone can read my work without being held to ransom to pay in dollars. Jeannie, I hope I'm saying your name right. Jeannie says, what do you do when your article has been rejected? And you are considering resubmitting it to another journal. If you're lucky, it gets rejected with some feedback, which is hurtful, right? Because we all want to be told we're brilliant, and rejection is someone telling us that we're not as brilliant, or at least we've got to remember they're actually not saying anything about us. They're saying this particular article is not yet brilliant, but it sometimes feels as if they're telling us we're not brilliant. So it hurts, but if you're lucky, you've got that feedback, even if it is hurtful, because that feedback should help you after you've sworn at the person and said that they're morons and you got over yourself. Read that feedback and see if it can help you make that article stronger. Then you need to send it to another journal, your journal B, or your journal C, or your journal D. And of course, don't just send it off as is. Make sure you go and read the aims and scope. Make sure you do another search in the new target journal to see if there's any additional literature on this phenomenon that you should incorporate. Read their author guidelines. Make sure you change the article to meet every single aspect of their word count, their formatting, their reference style. and send it to them. There's also a section that you can send it with a letter to the editor. I like to say in that letter to the editor, dear editor, thank you for considering my attached article entitled XYZ. I believe it contributes well to the conversation in your journal. In particular, it adds to what Johnson and Ulbeck's 2021 article was saying. So I've seen that being done quite often, where in the letter to the editor, sometimes it'll be just a little box that you fill in on an online platform. Sometimes there's no such thing as the letter to editor. Sometimes they tell you to attach a letter to the editor. It's not a bad idea. Don't make it too long, but just to say, here's my article. This is what my article's titled. And I think it's a good fit for your article, for your journal, because, and then you can quote their aims and scope, because it does, as you say in your aims and scope, XYZ, or because it draws on this person's article and that person's article, which were in your journal or whatever. What are the key elements to identify a predatory journal? Look, the one thing I can say is I'm going to tell you how you can identify a predatory journal. But my main point is don't worry about predatory journals. Just think about what is your contribution and where are you drawing on the conversation, because that won't be predatory. If you stick to that criteria, what am I saying and who am I saying it to, and where are they publishing? Where are the people in my field publishing? You'll be fine. The people who get caught, I mean, look, any of us could get caught by predatory publications, but usually people get caught by predatory publications because they just, I've got to get a publication. I've got to get a publication. They're not, I've got to contribute. I've just got to get a publication. And so where can I get it? Who looks like they'll do it the fastest? Well, I got an email from some guy asking me, saying that they'll publish my article in a week. I'll send it there. If they're emailing you and asking you for an article, they're probably predatory. The only time a journal, high quality journal would email you and ask you for an article is if it's on a special edition and they say, we've got a special edition coming on this topic, and it's more like an invitation to consider it. If you're getting an email saying, we want to publish you, it's predatory. If it says that they're going to do it in a hurry, it's predatory. Proper publication takes time. As I said, you ask for reviewers, they let you down, you have to find more reviewers, they let you down, they give you feedback, you have to resubmission. If they're promising to get it published in a week, it's predatory. If the email's got spelling and grammar errors, it's predatory. If they have a website that looks a bit dodgy and homemade, it's predatory. If you don't know any of the names in the editorial board that are in your field, it's predatory. But the bottom line is, if you stick with any of these accredited ones, you should be okay. If you look at where the people who are important in your field, who are doing cutting edge work in your field, where are they publishing? That's not predatory. That's high impact. And I think that's it. I think we're a bit over time, but hopefully some of what I said was helpful. My most important thing is just to remind you that you have contributions to make to the conversation. So be bold, be brave, think of what you want to contribute, think about where that conversation is taking place, and get out there and make your mark. And when you get rejected, dust yourself off and try again. I will end with telling you that one of my second or third most highly cited paper was rejected 3 times before it was published. So I just was determined to get that contribution out there, and eventually I succeeded. So if you get rejected, I can assure you that that is just par for the course, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. Thank you so much for your time. Don't forget to click on the link to do the evaluation. Bye, everyone.